They always ask me what Freddie Mercury was like in his final days, but no one can imagine what really happened that early morning when he held my hand and whispered something I've never told anyone. I was the nurse responsible for caring for him when the pain could no longer be hidden, when the stage lights existed only in memory, and when every word had to be rationed. But that night he called me by name and said something that changed how I see life, fame, and fear. Now I ask you, if you were with Freddie Mercury in his last 5 minutes of life, what would you ask him? I was called urgently by Jim Hutton on a cold November afternoon. His voice on the phone was steady, but weighted with something I'd learned to recognize after weeks of caring for Freddie: controlled grief. "He doesn't want anyone else in the room," Jim said quietly. "Only you." When I arrived at Garden Lodge, the house felt different than it had on previous visits. The atmosphere was heavy, but not with fear. It was the sensation of goodbye that no one wanted to admit was coming. The kind of silence that settles over a place when everyone knows what's approaching but refuses to speak it aloud. I made my way upstairs to Freddie's bedroom, carrying my medical bag and trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever state I'd find him in. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the faint sound of music playing. Queen, of course, it was always Queen. But when I entered, Freddie gestured weakly toward the stereo. "Turn it off, darling," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Today, no music. I need silence to hear myself." I did as he asked, and the room fell into a quiet so complete it felt almost sacred. In all the weeks I'd been caring for him, I'd never heard him request silence. Music had always been his companion, his comfort, his language when words failed. Freddie was propped up against several pillows, looking impossibly fragile in his silk pajamas. The disease had taken so much from him physically, but his eyes, those expressive, intelligent eyes, still held that spark, that defiance that had defined him on stage for decades. Despite his obvious weakness, he still tried to maintain his humor. "Nurse," he said with the ghost of a smile, "life's a tricky song, isn't it? Never quite resolves the way you expect." I moved to check his vital signs, noting that his breathing was irregular, more labored than it had been even yesterday. But what struck me most was how he seemed more concerned about everyone else than about himself. He kept asking if Jim was okay, if the others downstairs were managing, if I was getting enough rest. "Freddie," I said gently, "you need to worry about yourself right now." He shook his head slightly. "What's there to worry about? The song's nearly finished. I can hear the final notes coming." There was a strange calm about him that day, something I hadn't seen before. He wasn't fighting anymore, wasn't pretending that things would get better. He was simply accepting that the music was reaching its conclusion, and he was preparing to leave the stage with as much grace as he could muster. After a long moment of silence, he turned his head to look at me directly. His gaze was searching, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. "Do you think I made a difference?" he asked quietly. "In the world, I mean. Do you think any of it mattered?" The question caught me off guard. Here was a man who had performed for hundreds of thousands at Live Aid, who had written songs that would live forever, who had changed the face of rock music. And he was asking me if he'd made a difference. I sat down in the chair beside his bed and took his hand. "Freddie," I said, my voice firm with conviction, "you changed lives. You're still changing them. Every person who ever felt like they didn't fit in, who felt different or scared or alone, you gave them permission to be exactly who they are." He closed his eyes, and I saw a tear slip down his cheek. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." In my opinion, in that moment I truly felt for the first time that artists like him carry a weight we never see. The weight of proving they're not just a show, not just entertainment, but something real and lasting that touches the human soul. It was a burden he'd carried alone for so long, and now, at the end, he just needed to know it had been worth it. "Rest now," I told him, adjusting his pillows. "You've earned it." He smiled faintly. "Not yet, darling. I have a few more words left to sing." About an hour later, Freddie's lips were dry and cracked. He gestured weakly toward the water glass on his nightstand, and I immediately reached for it, bringing it to his mouth. But when he tried to lift his hand to hold the glass himself, I saw the tremor, the complete lack of strength. His fingers couldn't grip. They just hovered in the air, shaking slightly, before falling back onto the bed. I gently placed my hand under his, supporting it, guiding the glass to his lips. He took small sips, and when he was done, he looked at me with a soft, self-deprecating smile. "Look at me," he said, his voice carrying a trace of that famous theatrical flair even now. "Needing help to drink. What a diva's fall." I couldn't help but smile back. "Even queens need to rest," I replied. He laughed, a weak, breathy sound, but genuine. For a moment, the man behind the legend was visible, the person who could still find humor in the darkest moments, who refused to let go of his wit, even as his body betrayed him. But then, as quickly as the lightness had come, it vanished. His expression shifted, became serious, almost urgent. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me forget to breathe. "I'm not afraid of dying," he said quietly, each word measured and deliberate. "I'm afraid of being forgotten." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. This wasn't a medical question. This wasn't something I could address with medication or comfort measures. This was existential, a fear that went deeper than physical pain, deeper than death itself. I stayed silent, because what could I say? How do you reassure someone of their legacy when they're lying in a bed, stripped of all the glamour and power that once defined them? How do you convince a dying man that the world will remember him? Freddie took a shaky breath and continued, his voice gaining a kind of desperate strength. "Promise me," he said, gripping my hand with surprising force. "Promise me you'll tell them I wasn't a tragedy." I felt tears forming in my eyes, but I blinked them back. He needed me to be strong right now, needed me to be the witness to his truth. "I promise," I said firmly, "I will never let your story be reduced to suffering. You were so much more than that." He nodded slightly, seeming to accept my words, to trust them. Then he took another deep breath, as if gathering strength for something important. "My voice may fade," he said softly, "but the truth shouldn't." There was such conviction in those words, such determination. He wasn't just talking about his singing voice. He was talking about his message, his impact, the things he'd tried to say through his music and his life, about being different, about refusing to apologize for who you are, about loving boldly even when the world judges you for it. Suddenly, he gestured toward the nightstand. "Write something for me," he said. "Please, I need to..." I quickly grabbed a notebook and pen from my bag, ready to transcribe whatever he wanted to say. But when I looked at him expectantly, pen poised over paper, he opened his mouth and nothing came out. He tried again, his lips moving, his face straining with effort, but the words wouldn't form. The exhaustion was too much. Whatever message he'd wanted to leave, whatever final statement he'd been composing in his mind, his body wouldn't cooperate. His hand reached out toward the pen, trembling violently, as if he thought maybe he could write it himself if his voice wouldn't work, but his fingers couldn't close around it. They just shook in mid-air, a heartbreaking pantomime of intention without the strength to execute. I gently lowered his hand back to the bed, holding it between both of mine. "It's okay," I whispered. "Rest now. You don't have to say everything today." But I could see in his eyes that it wasn't okay. This felt like his last attempt to leave a final message, a last piece of himself for the world. And his body, the instrument that had carried his voice to millions, had finally cruelly failed him. He closed his eyes, a single tear running down his cheek, and I understood that this was what true helplessness looked like. Not physical weakness, but the inability to say what desperately needs to be said. As the afternoon light began to fade through the bedroom windows, Freddie turned his head slightly to look outside. The gardens of Garden Lodge were visible from where he lay, though I doubt he could see them clearly anymore. His vision had been failing, along with everything else. He stared in that direction for a long moment before speaking, his voice contemplative and sad. "They think fame fills you," he said quietly, "that it makes you complete, makes you whole, but it drains you if you're not careful. It takes and takes until there's nothing left but the image everyone expects." I'd heard variations of this sentiment from other patients facing their mortality. The regret, the reassessment of what truly mattered. But coming from Freddie Mercury, from someone who had lived at the absolute pinnacle of fame, it carried a particular weight. I found myself asking, perhaps too boldly, "What do you miss most?" He didn't hesitate. Silence, privacy, and singing without pain. The simplicity of that answer broke my heart. Not the stadiums, not the adoration, not the gold records or the mansions. Just the basic human experiences that fame had stolen from him. The ability to be alone with his thoughts, to walk through the world unnoticed, to use his voice without it being a performance or, now, an impossibility. After a moment, his expression softened, and he said a name I'd heard him mention before. "Mary. Mary Austin," he continued, his voice warming slightly despite his physical deterioration. "She was my home, you know. Even when I didn't know where I belonged, even when I was searching everywhere else. She was home." I knew about Mary from the tabloids and from things Jim had mentioned. The woman Freddie had loved, had been engaged to, who remained his closest friend, even after he'd acknowledged his sexuality and their romantic relationship had ended. She visited regularly, though I hadn't seen her today. "She knows me," Freddie said, as if reading my thoughts. "Not Freddie Mercury, me, the person I was before all of this, and the person I still am underneath." But then his mood shifted again, becoming more anxious. He looked at me with an expression that seemed almost pleading. "I'm terrified of disappointing them," he confessed. "The fans, they see me as invincible, as larger than life. But I never was. I was just a man who could sing." His breathing became shorter, more labored, and I could see panic starting to creep into his eyes. I immediately took his hand, holding it firmly, using my other hand to check his pulse. "Breathe with me, Freddie," I said calmly. "Slow and steady. You're okay." He focused on my voice, on the rhythm I was setting, and gradually his breathing stabilized. But the fear didn't completely leave his face. "Nurse," he said urgently, gripping my hand tighter, "promise me something. Promise me no one will see me like this. No photographs, no stories, no spectacle, please." I understood immediately what he was asking. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't about protecting his image in some superficial way. This was about dignity, about controlling the one thing he still could, how he would be remembered. "I promise," I said firmly, "no one will violate your privacy, not while I'm here." He relaxed slightly, trusting my word. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again, more to himself than to me. "People love the legend," he said softly. "The costumes, the performances, the persona. But I really hope, that someone remembers the man. The person who loved his cats, who couldn't cook to save his life, who collected art because it made him feel something real." I squeezed his hand. "They will, Freddie. I'll make sure of it." The pain was increasing. I could see it in the tension around his eyes, in the way his jaw clenched. But even through the pain, he tried to maintain that spark of humor that had defined him. "At least I didn't lose my charm, right?" he said with a weak smile. "Still devastatingly handsome, even like this." I couldn't help but laugh, tears running down my face. "Absolutely devastating. I agreed. He closed his eyes, seemingly satisfied with that small victory, making someone laugh despite everything, performing even now, even at the end. I dozed off in the chair beside Freddie's bed, my body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of hours of vigilance. But around 2 in the morning, I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. I opened my eyes to find Freddie looking at me, his face pale in the dim lamplight, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately pulled me fully awake. "Can you stay?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Just stay, please." "I'm not going anywhere," I assured him, repositioning my chair closer to the bed and taking his hand. It felt cold, almost weightless, like touching paper. He seemed to be gathering something. Not just strength, but courage. As if what he was about to say required every ounce of energy and determination he had left in his failing body. For several minutes he just breathed, each inhalation a conscious effort. I waited, not rushing him, understanding that whatever was coming needed its own time. Finally, he spoke. "I've sung to millions of people," he said slowly, deliberately. "Stadiums full of voices singing back to me, but right now in this moment I only need one listener." The intimacy of that statement, the way he was choosing to share his final thoughts with me, a nurse he'd known for only a few weeks, felt both humbling and sacred. "I'm here," I said softly. "I'm listening." Freddie closed his eyes, and I saw his lips moving slightly, as if he was rehearsing the words internally before releasing them into the world. When he opened his eyes again, they were glistening with unshed tears. "Tell them," he whispered, each word costing him. "Tell them the show was never about perfection." He paused, breathing heavily, and I waited, sensing there was more. "It was about..." Another pause, longer this time. "It was about love." Those 4 words carried the weight of an entire career, an entire life spent performing, creating, connecting. All of it, in the end, distilled down to this simple truth. It had always been about love. Love for the music, love for the audience, love expressed through art when it couldn't be expressed any other way. I heard footsteps outside the room, and Jim Hutton appeared in the doorway. His face was drawn, exhausted, his eyes red from crying. He'd been Freddie's partner for years, had stood by him through everything, and now he was watching the person he loved slip away. Jim moved toward the bed, but Freddie raised one trembling hand slightly. "Let me finish," he said to Jim, his voice gentle but firm. "Please." Jim nodded and stayed by the door, giving Freddie the space he needed to complete whatever final statement he was composing. Freddie turned his head slightly on the pillow, looking directly at me. His eyes were searching my face, as if he needed to see confirmation that I understood, that I would remember, that his words wouldn't be lost. And then, with tremendous effort, speaking so quietly that I had to lean in close to hear him, he said, "Don't let the world turn my ending into fear." He paused, gathering the last reserves of his strength. "Let it be freedom." The words hung in the air between us, profound and devastating. He wasn't just talking about his own death. He was talking about what it could mean for others, for everyone who was sick, everyone who was dying in silence and shame, everyone who was terrified of the disease that was taking him. He wanted his death to represent freedom, not fear, liberation, not tragedy, permission for others to live authentically, to die with dignity, to refuse to let shame define their final chapter. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. This moment was too important, too sacred to interrupt with any movement. "I understand," I whispered. "I promise I'll tell them." Jim had moved closer now, standing on the other side of the bed, his own tears falling silently. He reached for Freddie's other hand, and the 3 of us sat there in the lamplight, connected by grief and love, and the profound privilege of witnessing truth spoken in its purest form. Outside, the world slept, unaware that one of its greatest voices was preparing to fall silent. A little before dawn, as the darkness outside began to soften with the first hints of grey light, Freddie made a conscious, deliberate effort to look at me. It wasn't easy for him. His neck muscles barely responded anymore. His body was shutting down system by system, but he turned his head on the pillow with such determination that I knew whatever he was about to say mattered more than the pain it cost him. His eyes found mine, and they were clear, clearer than they'd been in days, as if some final reserve of consciousness had flooded back for this one last moment. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thin as tissue paper. "Thank you for treating me as a man, not a myth." The gratitude in those words devastated me. Here was someone who had been worshipped by millions, immortalized in music and performance, and all he wanted at the end was to be seen as human, to be treated with the simple dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their fame or their failures. Jim was standing on the other side of the bed now, holding Freddie's left hand while I held his right. Silent tears were streaming down Jim's face, but he made no sound. He'd been so strong through everything, so present and devoted, and now he was watching the person he loved take his final breaths. Freddie's gaze shifted to Jim, and something passed between them. A look of such profound love and sorrow that I had to glance away, feeling like an intruder on their private goodbye. Then Freddie spoke again, each word requiring enormous effort. "Take care of them," he murmured, and I knew he meant Mary, the band members, the friends who had become his chosen family. They need it more than I do now. Even at the very end, he was thinking of others, worrying about how they would cope, how they would grieve, whether they would be okay without him. It was so characteristic of who he'd been throughout his illness, more concerned with everyone else's pain than his own. He took a deep breath then, slow, deliberate, conscious. It reminded me of a singer taking that final breath before the last note of a song, preparing to give everything to that one perfect moment before the music ends. His chest rose and fell, and in that silence I could almost hear the music he'd spent his life creating, the voice that had moved millions, the performer who had refused to be anything less than extraordinary. Then he turned his head one last time to look at me, and with tremendous effort, with every ounce of strength remaining in his dying body, he spoke his final words. "When the curtain falls, remember, I chose the ending." The words were barely audible, but they carried absolute conviction. This was his final performance, his last act of control in a life that had often felt out of his hands. He was choosing how to exit, choosing his final message, refusing to be a passive victim of his disease. After speaking, he squeezed my hand with a force that shocked me. Where it came from, I'll never know. It was as if all the energy left in his body concentrated into that one grip, that one final connection to another human being. And then he relaxed. His hand went slack in mine. His breathing, which had been labored and irregular for hours, simply stopped. There was no dramatic moment, no struggle, no fight. He just let go. The room became completely silent, as silent as he'd requested hours earlier when he'd asked me to turn off the music. It was the silence of ending, of completion, of a performance finished. Jim was sobbing quietly now, his forehead resting against Freddie's shoulder. I sat there for another moment, still holding that cooling hand, honoring the privilege of having been present for this most private, most sacred of moments. Finally, I stood slowly and walked to the door to inform the others who were waiting downstairs. My legs felt unsteady, my eyes were burning with tears I'd been holding back for hours. As I descended the stairs, I could hear Bohemian Rhapsody playing softly from somewhere in the house. Someone must have turned on the music again, and I thought about what Freddie had told me, about his deepest fear. His greatest fear wasn't dying, it was being misunderstood. He wanted the world to know that his life had been about love, that his ending was about freedom, that behind the legend was a man who felt deeply, loved fiercely, and faced death with the same courage he'd brought to the stage. I would carry his words for the rest of my life, and I would make sure the world remembered not just the myth, but the man.